Most people treat walking like a consolation prize. Like, it's what you do when you're not disciplined enough for the gym, when you can't run, when you've given up on something harder. That framing is wrong. And it's costing people. Specifically, it's costing them their brain. Here's what I want to start with, because this is the number that stopped me when I first came across it. Researchers at JAMA Neurology tracked over 78,000 adults, real people wearing wrist accelerometers, monitored for nearly 7 years. What they found was a clean dose-response relationship between daily walking and dementia risk. People who hit around 9,800 steps per day cut their dementia risk in half. Not reduced it slightly, cut it in half. But here's the part most people never hear. You don't need 10,000 steps to start getting the protection. The benefit kicked in at just 3,800 steps per day, roughly a 25% reduction in dementia risk. That's a 20-minute walk.
Now, why does this happen?
It's not magic. There's a mechanism. When you walk consistently, you increase blood flow to the hippocampus, the region of the brain that handles memory, learning, and spatial reasoning. That increased flow does two things. It feeds the tissue with oxygen and nutrients, and it clears out inflammatory proteins, including tau, that accumulate over time and are directly linked to cognitive decline. The Harvard Aging Brain Study put this more precisely. Researchers found that physically active older adults showed slower tau accumulation in the brain's temporal regions compared to sedentary adults with similar baseline amyloid levels. In other words, walking wasn't just slowing memory loss. It was slowing the biological process that causes it. I used to think of the brain as something that just deteriorated with age, like erosion, inevitable, fixed. What changed my thinking was understanding that the hippocampus is one of the few regions of the brain that can actually grow new tissue in adulthood, and that aerobic exercise is one of the primary triggers for that growth. Walking doesn't just protect what you have. Under the right conditions, it can build more. And that's just the brain. The next system that changes when you start walking every day surprised me even more, because nobody connects these two things until they understand the mechanism. Let me tell you something that I genuinely didn't expect to find when I first started researching walking. Your eyes are connected to your legs, not metaphorically, mechanically. Here's what I mean. One of the leading causes of irreversible blindness worldwide is glaucoma, a condition driven by excess fluid pressure building up inside the eye. That pressure compresses the optic nerve, and once that nerve is damaged, you don't get that vision back. What most people don't realize is that aerobic exercise, specifically the kind that gets your heart rate up moderately, like a brisk walk, measurably lowers intraocular pressure. A systematic review published in 2024 confirmed that aerobic exercise consistently reduces eye pressure in both healthy individuals and people already diagnosed with glaucoma. The mechanism runs through blood flow and fluid drainage pathways in the eye that respond directly to cardiovascular activity. And beyond glaucoma, sustained walking also improves blood flow to the visual cortex, the region of your brain that processes what your eyes are sending it. More blood flow, better signal processing. It's the same principle that makes the brain sharper with walking, just applied to vision. I'll be honest, when I first encountered this, it felt like the kind of obscure connection researchers find just to publish something. But the physiology is clean. Your eyes are vascular tissue. They respond to circulation the same way your heart and brain do. Now, the heart. I want to address something directly here, because there's a belief that runs through most fitness culture that you need to be running to protect your cardiovascular system. That if you're just walking, you're doing the lesser version. A 2022 analysis published in the American Heart Association's journal Circulation found that people meeting the recommended levels of moderate physical activity, which walking qualifies as, had a 22 to 25% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. People who doubled that amount dropped their risk by up to 38%. And here's the part that reframes everything for me. The additional benefit from quadrupling moderate exercise was greater than the benefit from the same increase in vigorous exercise, meaning more walking outperformed more running at the margin. The mechanism behind this is straightforward once you understand it. Walking trains your cardiovascular system in a sustainable, repeatable way. It lowers resting blood pressure. It improves the flexibility of arterial walls. It reduces LDL and raises HDL over time. Your heart doesn't care whether you're sprinting or striding. It responds to demand. Regular walking creates consistent, manageable demand. And consistent demand builds a more resilient system than sporadic intensity ever will. Now, your pancreas. This one I find genuinely counterintuitive every time I revisit it. Duke University ran a randomized 6-month trial on 150 adults with prediabetes. They divided participants into groups. Some did brisk walking, some did vigorous jogging, both covering the same distance. At the end of 6 months, the walkers showed a 7% improvement in glucose tolerance. The joggers, 2%. The researchers found the reason in how the two intensities use fuel. High-intensity exercise burns glucose as its primary fuel. Moderate-intensity exercise burns fat. And when you clear fat from inside muscle tissue, you remove the metabolic interference that blocks glucose uptake. You're not just managing blood sugar. You're removing the thing that was preventing your muscles from absorbing it properly in the first place. The pancreas, in this context, gets a rest. It doesn't have to produce as much insulin when your muscles are efficiently doing their job. And a pancreas under less chronic demand is a pancreas that stays functional longer. What's interesting is that these three systems, your eyes, your heart, your metabolic regulation, are all responding to the same underlying change. Better circulation, reduced systemic inflammation, more efficient energy processing. It's the same mechanism expressing itself in different places, and the lungs are part of this same story. What walking does, there is not what most people expect. And I want to get into that next. Here's something I find genuinely underappreciated about walking in the gut. Most people think of digestion as a passive process. Food goes in, the body handles it, waste comes out. But your digestive tract is heavily dependent on movement, specifically on the mechanical stimulation that happens when your body is in motion. Walking contracts and relaxes the muscles around your abdominal cavity in a rhythmic way. That rhythmic compression accelerates intestinal transit time, the speed at which material moves through your colon. Faster transit time means less time for potentially harmful compounds to stay in contact with the colon wall. And that contact time, it turns out, is directly linked to colorectal cancer risk. Physical activity may prevent approximately 15% of colon cancers, according to a review published in the World Journal of Gastrointestinal Oncology. That's not a marginal number. That represents millions of cases globally that could be avoided. Not with a drug, not with a procedure, but with consistent movement. And what I find even more striking is what happens after a diagnosis. A nationwide study out of South Korea tracked over 43,000 colorectal cancer patients and found that those who maintained regular physical activity, including walking, after their diagnosis had a 21% lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to inactive patients. 21%. Their bodies were actively fighting the disease more effectively, not because of treatment differences, because of movement. The mechanism runs through inflammation, insulin regulation, and immune modulation. Walking keeps all three in a more favorable state, and a colon that isn't chronically inflamed, isn't chronically insulin spiked, and is being flushed regularly, is a colon doing its actual job. Now, muscle. I want to address something directly here, because there's a persistent belief that walking is a cardiovascular tool and nothing else. That if you want muscle, you need the gym. That's too narrow. Walking, especially when done with intention, incline, pace variation, distance, creates genuine mechanical load on the quadriceps, glutes, hamstrings, calves, and the deep stabilizing muscles of the core and spine. These aren't muscles being pushed to their limit, but they are being trained for endurance and postural stability. And for a large portion of the population, people who sit for 8 to 10 hours a day, those muscles are severely undertrained. Walking doesn't just tone them, it reactivates them. The key is removing the ceiling. Flat ground at a comfortable pace will plateau quickly. But add a hill, add a weighted vest, or simply increase your pace into that zone where you're working but can still hold a conversation. And you've created a stimulus your body will adapt to. Now, bones. This is where I think walking's reputation is most underestimated. Bone is living tissue. It responds to mechanical load the same way muscle does, by getting denser and stronger. When you walk, you're applying cyclical compressive force to your skeleton. That force signals bone-forming cells, called osteoblasts, to increase activity. Remove that signal through sedentary living, and the resorption side of bone remodeling dominates. Density drops, fragility increases. A large-scale prospective study from the UK Biobank, analyzing over 348,000 participants, found that people who walked at a brisk pace had meaningfully lower rates of osteoporosis incidence and fractures compared to slow walkers, even after adjusting for genetic predisposition. That last part matters. Even people with a genetic vulnerability to osteoporosis showed reduced risk if they walked at a higher pace. The genes weren't destiny. The movement created a competing signal. Osteoporosis currently affects over 10% of adults aged 50 and older in the United States. Current data suggests that will rise to nearly 14% by 2030. We're watching a slow-motion bone density crisis unfold, and the primary intervention remains weight-bearing exercise, which is, in its most accessible form, walking. And then there's back pain, which may be the most practically important thing I cover in this video for a lot of people. A landmark randomized controlled trial published in The Lancet in 2024, the Walk-Back Trial, run by Macquarie University in Australia, followed 701 adults who had recently recovered from low back pain. Half were assigned to a progressive individualized walking program. The other half received no structured intervention. The result? People who walked regularly went nearly twice as long without a recurrence of their back pain compared to the control group. Not somewhat longer, nearly double. The reason isn't mysterious once you understand the anatomy. Your spinal discs don't have a direct blood supply. They absorb nutrients through a process called imbibition, essentially mechanical pumping. Movement compresses and decompresses the disc, drawing in fluid and nutrients. Stillness starves them. Walking is one of the most efficient ways to keep that pumping mechanism active. Simultaneously, walking strengthens the deep stabilizing muscles along the spine, the erector spinae, multifidus, and the muscles of the hip and pelvis that are responsible for absorbing ground force before it reaches your lower back. Most back pain isn't a structural problem. It's a stability problem. And walking, done consistently and with decent posture, is one of the most effective stability training tools available. There's one more system I want to cover, and it's the one most people in this position actually care about most. But I'll get to that in a moment. The last system on this list is the one I think most people don't actually connect to walking. And it might be the most important. Your brain is a biological organ. It's made of tissue, supplied by blood vessels, regulated by hormones, and shaped, literally structurally shaped, by how you behave. One of the behaviors with the most documented impact on brain chemistry is sustained, rhythmic, moderate movement. Walking. Here's what's actually happening when you walk consistently. Serotonin and norepinephrine, the two neurotransmitters most directly targeted by antidepressant medications, are transiently elevated after each bout of aerobic movement. Acute exercise modulates their circulating levels in ways that pharmaceutical intervention attempts to replicate pharmacologically. And the brain-derived neurotrophic factor I mentioned earlier in connection with dementia. It also plays a central role in mood regulation. BDNF supports the growth and survival of neurons in regions involved in emotional processing. Walking keeps that support system active. A 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis published in JMIR Public Health, covering 75 randomized controlled trials and over 8,600 participants, found that walking meaningfully reduced both depressive and anxiety symptoms across a wide range of populations. And a separate 2024 meta-analysis in the BMJ found that exercise reduced depression to the same extent as antidepressants, and in some cases performed better. I want to be careful about how I frame this. If you're experiencing clinical depression, medication, therapy, and professional support are real tools, and they matter. Walking doesn't replace that. But what the data clearly shows is that even people without a diagnosis, people who are just worn down, overstimulated, or carrying low-grade stress, experience measurable mood improvement from consistent walking, and they don't need to be told it's working. In several studies, participants' moods improved even when they weren't informed that walking was supposed to help. There's a simple reason for this that I find clarifying. Chronic mental fatigue and persistent low mood are often, in part, a stress response. Cortisol stays elevated. The nervous system doesn't get a reliable off-ramp. Sustained aerobic activity, walking, triggers parasympathetic recovery. It lowers cortisol. It regulates circadian rhythms. It improves sleep architecture, which in turn stabilizes the mood systems that need overnight repair. The whole system gets a reset it can't get from sitting still, and walking with another person amplifies this. Social connection activates separate neural pathways, oxytocin, shared attentional focus, that compound the baseline benefit. The best walks I've had were not the ones where I was optimizing my pace or tracking my steps. They were the ones where I was genuinely present with someone outside. So, that's the full picture of what 30 days of daily walking actually does. To your brain, your eyes, your heart, your pancreas, your lungs, your colon, your bones, your spine, and your mind. Not one of these systems is unaffected. Not one. The question isn't whether it works. The question is just the protocol. Before you go, I want to give you a framework that'll make this sustainable, because that's actually the part that matters most. Doing it once doesn't change anything. Doing it consistently changes everything. And the mistake I see people make is trying to go from 0 to an hour a day immediately and burning out in 2 weeks. The FIT formula is simple. 3 variables: frequency, intensity, time. Our frequency to park is how often, ideally every day, because the data on consistency is clear. But if daily isn't realistic right now, 3 to 5 times a week is enough to produce measurable changes in every system I've described. The goal is a sustainable rhythm, not an impressive number on week 1. Intensity is how hard. For most people, most of the time, the target is a brisk but conversational pace, somewhere around 2 to 3 miles per hour. If you can't hold a sentence without gasping, you've crossed from aerobic into anaerobic. That's not necessarily bad, but it's a different stimulus and it creates recovery demands that can interrupt the habit. The sweet spot for walking is the zone where you feel your body working, but your breathing is still controlled. That's where the metabolic and cardiovascular benefits are most accessible. Time is duration. 30 minutes a day is the evidence-based target. That's the threshold that appears repeatedly in the literature for meaningful improvements in cardiovascular health, bone density, mood, and metabolic function. If you're starting from nothing, 10 minutes still produces benefit. The principle is, begin with what you can actually do today and add just a little more each week. One rule of thumb: when you want to progress, change only one variable at a time. Add a day before you add distance. Add distance before you add incline. Trying to increase all 3 simultaneously is how people hurt themselves, lose momentum, and quit. The most important moment isn't the first walk. It's the walk on day 12 when you don't feel like it. That's the one that builds the habit. That's the one that changes the trajectory. If this helped you understand your body a little more clearly, that's what this channel is built for. Subscribe if you want to keep learning how these systems actually work.